You're about to discover something Russia never wanted to face. A system that is extremely hard to shoot down, hard to jam, hard to invade, and very difficult to silence. A system woven so deeply into and under the Baltic Sea that for years many in Moscow did not fully grasp how far NATO's reach was extending, or how much of its navy might be exposed because of it. And the most surprising part? This weapon is not a missile. It is not a submarine. It is not a drone. It is a network. A quiet mix of seabed sensors, underwater drones, coastal systems, and shared data links spread from Denmark to Finland, built piece by NATO's newest frontline states, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and integrated into Western intelligence infrastructure that already monitors huge portions of the world's oceans. Open source analysis suggests that, taken together, these national and NATO systems function like an underwater surveillance web across the Baltic, even though the exact layout and capabilities are not publicly known. According to NATO's Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation, the alliance has spent years developing and testing seabed sensors, hydroacoustic arrays, and autonomous underwater vehicles, including during Baltop's naval exercises. NATO CMRE publications describe how these systems are used to map the seabed, monitor critical underwater infrastructure, and experiment with new ways of tracking movement below the surface. What the public rarely sees is how these pieces fit into a larger picture, a listening architecture beneath one of the most strategically important seas on Earth. A sea that Russia relies on for submarines, naval access, covert operations, and according to multiple European intelligence services, potential routes for undersea sabotage and pressure. For decades, the Baltic was close to Russia's playground. Shallow waters, complex acoustics, and dense shipping lanes gave Russian submarines and special mission vessels places to hide. That started to change when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, when the Baltic states expanded their surveillance systems, and when NATO began connecting Scandinavian hydroacoustic networks to Western satellite and maritime intelligence databases. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute in London and Sweden's FOI Defense Research Agency now describe the Baltic Sea as one of the most intensely monitored maritime regions in the world, and in some assessments, one of the most transparent stretches of ocean for undersea movement. They argue that hiding there is becoming extremely difficult, especially for larger platforms. And that transformation starts not with weapons, but with sensors. To understand the scale of what is happening, you have to picture the Baltic itself. It is not deep and wide like the Atlantic. It is shallow, echo-filled, and cluttered with wrecks, pipelines, cables, and sediment layers that bounce sound in every direction. That makes life hard for submarines, and hard for those trying to detect them unless you have spent decades learning how to use those conditions. Finland has. Its navy operates seabed and bottom-moored sonar systems optimized for shallow water, described in Finnish defense publications as key tools for literal anti-submarine warfare. Sweden runs similar seabed listening arrays through FOI, which has published a long series of studies on acoustic modeling in the Baltic's complex environment. These systems do more than listen for submarines. They map propeller signatures, engine harmonics, hull shapes, and movement patterns. Over time, they build what naval analysts call an acoustic fingerprint library. OpenFOI research indicates that Sweden has long collected acoustic data and signatures in its surrounding waters. NATO added another layer with autonomous underwater vehicles tested in Baltop's exercises. During recent Baltop's drills, US, British, German, and Scandinavian navies have deployed unmanned underwater drones to scan the seabed, map infrastructure, and experiment with real-time undersea surveillance. NATO officials have openly said these missions help chart critical infrastructure, detect anomalies, and practice tracking underwater movement. These drones use synthetic aperture sonar to reveal objects buried in silt or hidden between rocks without announcing their presence on the surface. Since 2022, each Baltop's iteration has included more advanced unmanned underwater trials. Press releases mention individual tests but rarely connect the bigger picture. Sweden's seabed sensors, Finland's hydroacoustic networks, new undersea surveillance projects launched by Estonia and Latvia after the Nord Stream explosions, when governments pledged to better protect cables and pipelines, NATO's AUV mapping missions, US and UK undersea intelligence integration. Each system feeds into the next. Each sensor closes a blind spot. Each each detection algorithm refines the acoustic picture. Analysts at Rusai argue that for the first time in modern history, NATO now has something close to persistent awareness of much of the undersea movement in the Baltic Sea, especially along key routes and choke points. Russia did not plan for that. The Kremlin has always treated the Baltic Sea as a strategic corridor linking St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad to the wider world. But beneath the surface, the Baltic has long been one of Moscow's biggest vulnerabilities. FOI studies and European intelligence assessments note that Russia's Baltic fleet is constrained by shallow waters, predictable transit routes, and choke points that NATO can monitor with increasing regularity. Open-source naval analysis points out a simple fact. The Baltic is small. There are few deep hiding spots, few escape routes, and very few areas where a modern hydroacoustic network cannot listen. Even quiet diesel-electric Kilo-class submarines, often dubbed black holes by Western navies, face serious challenges once those networks are fused and data is shared. Yet the fleet is not Russia's greatest vulnerability. Kaliningrad is. The Russian exclave between Poland and Lithuania hosts anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, naval bases, and electronic warfare platforms. Moscow relies on it to project power into the Baltic and to challenge NATO's freedom of movement. What many analysts argue Russia did not fully anticipate was the degree to which NATO's growing undersea and maritime network could monitor maritime traffic linked to Kaliningrad in far greater detail than before. After the Nord Stream pipeline explosions in 2022, widely treated in European discourse as sabotage, though responsibility remains officially unresolved, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and others publicly announced expanded seabed surveillance for critical infrastructure protection. Defense analysts immediately highlighted a dual effect. The same sensors that protect cables and pipelines can also help detect submarines, special mission ships, and suspicious activity near infrastructure. Add Sweden and Finland's radar, sonar, and intelligence coverage stretching from the Arctic down through the Baltic, and a clearer picture appears. According to Baltic officials quoted in outlets like Dagens Nyheter, NATO can often follow Russian vessels as they leave port, trace many of their routes, and flag behavior that deviates from established patterns. For a state whose doctrine relies heavily on misdirection, covert deployments, and ambiguity, that reduction in uncertainty is a serious problem. NATO does not have to interfere with every move. It only has to watch, and Russia has to assume it is being watched. That is why analysts at RUSI and SIPA describe the Baltic today as a kind of NATO sensor trap, a region where Russia must operate as if a large share of its movements are being logged, modeled, and analyzed by multiple allies at once. And NATO is still building. When Sweden and Finland joined NATO, Russian officials publicly called it a strategic mistake. European defense planners saw something else. With every Baltic littoral state, except Russia inside the alliance, the Baltic Sea effectively became a NATO-dominated basin. Finland brings world-class shallow-water anti-submarine expertise from decades of operating in the acoustically complex Gulf of Finland. Swedish A-26 Blekinge-class submarines, described by Naval News and Janes as designed specifically for stealth in littoral waters, will add another tier to that undersea picture. Air-independent propulsion and modular payload bays allow them to linger quietly and conduct covert missions in exactly the environment Russian naval planners have long tried to exploit. Lithuania and Latvia contribute central surveillance infrastructure and coastal monitoring. Estonia brings highly regarded cyber and electronic warfare integration, anchored in years of experience dealing with Russian-linked cyber campaigns. Denmark controls the Danish Straits, the narrow exit Russia must use to move major warships from the Baltic into the North Sea. Each state adds a sensor, a node, or a choke point. NATO stitches them together. In 2023 and 2024, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe repeatedly described this as an increasingly integrated northern defense network, with the Baltic, Nordic, and Arctic theaters treated as one connected space. Detection alone is not enough. Deterrence also needs credible response. Finland's geography places NATO sensors and assets only tens of kilometers from key Russian naval areas near St. Petersburg. Sweden's island of Gotland sits at the center of the Baltic, controlling sea lanes and providing radar coverage deep into the region. Swedish military leaders and international reporting, including by Reuters, describe Gotland as one of the most strategically important and heavily defended islands in northern Europe, with coastal missile batteries, radars, air defenses, and rapid reaction forces forces deployed there. NATO air power completes the picture. F-35s from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and over time, Finland and other partners fly across the region. U.S. Air Force and allied officials have noted that the F-35's advanced sensors can detect and classify maritime and air targets at long range and share that data across NATO networks almost instantly. So, when a Russian submarine leaves Kaliningrad, when a corvette maneuvers in the Gulf of Finland, or a special mission vessel loiters near undersea cables, it is rarely being watched by one state alone. It is being watched by a network. This distributed sensor fusion is what makes NATO's Baltic system so powerful. No single country needs a perfect view. Together, they achieve something approaching continuous situational awareness across key parts of the theater. And the network is not just physical, it is digital. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania punch far above their weight in cyberspace. NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn has documented how Estonia in particular turned repeated Russian-linked cyber attacks into a catalyst for building some of the most advanced cyber defense structures in Europe. Sweden's FRA, Signals Intelligence Agency, monitors regional communications and radar activity. Finland contributes advanced electronic warfare systems designed to detect and characterize hostile emitters. Together, these capabilities track not only ships and submarines, but also Russian communications patterns and electronic behavior. If an unusual radar switches on near Kaliningrad, if a new electronic warfare system appears on the Kola Peninsula, if a warship shifts to combat mode communications, Nordic SIGINT agencies can detect it, and NATO can fuse that information with physical sensor data. Senior German and Nordic officers have publicly described the Baltic and adjacent airspace as among the most heavily monitored areas in Europe. That density of awareness is exactly what reduces Russia's room for maneuver. Gotland embodies this new reality on land. Strategists routinely call it an unsinkable aircraft carrier and arguably the most important island in northern Europe. From Gotland, Sweden can monitor maritime routes between Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, Finland, and Sweden, extend radar coverage and base forces that threaten hostile ships or aircraft in the central Baltic. Swedish defense documents and international reporting show that since 2016, the island has been steadily remilitarized, with coastal anti-ship missiles, armored units, and air defense systems returning after years of drawdown. For Russia, Gotland is less an island and more a potential blockade lever. In any crisis, NATO would not necessarily need to attack the Baltic Fleet directly. It could focus on denying the fleet's safe movement. Gotland helps make that option credible. After the Nord Stream explosions, the focus on undersea infrastructure surveillance accelerated. Danish, Finnish, and Swedish officials spoke publicly about protecting pipelines, power cables, and offshore platforms. The tools they funded for that mission, seabed sensors, underwater drones, and anomaly detection software, are the same tools needed to track hostile underwater activity. By 2024 to 2025, Nordic procurement records show significant investment in these technologies, feeding more real-time data into NATO systems, whether the immediate purpose is civilian protection or military awareness. The effect is a kind of digital minefield, not explosive, but informational, a space where every movement, every transmission, and every route choice leaves a trace somewhere in the system. All of this changes the strategic balance over the next decade. For years, many Western planners saw the Baltics as NATO's vulnerable flank. Today, a growing number of analysts argue that the region is becoming Russia's most monitored theater, more transparent, more mapped, and more difficult to operate in without being seen. Putin's government spent 2 decades trying to widen Russia's influence in northern Europe. NATO's evolving surveillance network compresses that space instead. It reduces Russia's ability to surprise, limits its escalation options, constrains its freedom of movement, and erodes its informational advantage in the Baltic Sea, all without NATO firing a shot. This is why many defense researchers say the Kremlin's real concern is not any single NATO weapon system, but NATO transparency. Transparency shrinks gray zones. Russia's doctrine depends on operating in spaces where responsibility is unclear and actions can be denied. In a sensor-dense Baltic, anonymous ships, unexplained cable disruptions, and unmarked submarines become harder to sustain as plausible stories when multiple allies collect overlapping evidence. Transparency also challenges Russia's reliance on speed. Moscow has often tried to move faster than Western political decision-making. But when detection is almost real-time and evidence is recorded by several states simultaneously, political hesitation matters less. Allies can base their decisions on shared situational awareness rather than on rumors or delayed intelligence. The hidden advantage in all of this is not technology alone. It is cooperation. Russia's command system is largely vertical. Information flows up, orders flow down, and initiative can be constrained by fear of punishment. NATO's Baltic and Nordic structure is far more horizontal. Finland detects a submarine signature. Norway confirms it. Sweden analyses the acoustic pattern. Lithuania adds electronic data. NATO fuses the feeds. US or European satellites provide additional imagery. In many cases, this process can unfold in minutes rather than days. You cannot jam that kind of cooperation in one move. You cannot easily outrun it. You cannot exploit a single point of failure because there is no single point. The strength comes from integration, not from one sensor or one platform. For Russia, this means something fundamental. It cannot escalate in the Baltic region without NATO seeing at least some of the preparation. It cannot easily mass forces, reposition key assets, or rehearse major operations without triggering sensor alerts somewhere in the network. That does not make conflict impossible. And this analysis is not predicting specific outcomes, but it does make miscalculation riskier and surprise harder to achieve. For NATO, it marks a shift from being reactive to being more predictive. The alliance is not just hoping for stability in the Baltic. It is trying to engineer a form of stability based on visibility. Surprise becomes harder, ambiguity becomes rarer, options for covert pressure shrink. The most powerful thing NATO has hidden in the Baltics is not a missile, not a submarine, not a fighter jet, and not a drone. It is awareness. A level of situational awareness that, according to open source analysis from institutes like RUSI, FOI, the Atlantic Council, and others, Russia would struggle to match, disrupt at scale, or fully escape because it rests on something Moscow has never been able to reproduce in the same way. Deep, institutionalized trust between allies. And that is what turns the Baltic network into a real form of deterrence. Quiet, continuous, hard to see from the outside, but always there in the background, shaping decisions in Moscow long before any crisis reaches the surface. This video is based entirely on publicly available information and open source analysis. It does not use or reveal classified material, and it is intended to explain long-term security trends, not to glorify conflict, encourage violence, or predict specific outcomes.